Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here, episode 2540 of The Tom Woods Show with our old friend Bob Murphy. You remember old Bob from the old Contra Krugman days. You probably remember other things about him, but I'm particularly fond of those 5 years we spent together critiquing columns of Paul Krugman. But Bob has other things to be said for him as well. He has a PhD in economics from New York University. I was reminded of that quite a few times during the Contra Krugman days because I have no degree in economics, and that was one of the running gags of the show. He's chief economist with Infineo, and we're going to talk today about, well, a bunch of things related to the economy right now and various proposed policies. But because I wanted to recall the old glory days of Contra Krugman, I thought, well, I have one tweet from Krugman that we could talk about. So that's what we're reduced to, ladies and gentlemen. I got a tweet, but it needs to be talked about. But Anyway, Bob, glad to have you.
Glad to be here again, Tom. And it is amazing how many people come up to me, and that's what they bring up is, oh, I love Contra Krugman. When are you guys going to bring that back? And hey, when Krugman becomes relevant, maybe we will.
That's right. Well, this was the best Krugman. We might as well start with that. I mean, we probably teased it a little bit. Well, let's start with Krugman, then we'll get into other things. From my vantage point, it looks to me as if he's trying his best to throw Harris a lifeline on this whole price gouging thing. And so here's what he writes in this tweet. Harris's gouging proposal, and by the way, we are going to talk about this in a minute, but I assume most people by now have heard that her belief is that the rise in grocery prices is being driven by price gouging grocery store owners. And so that's what Krugman's responding to. So he says, Harris's gouging proposal looks mild compared with the price control hysteria. But some are writing as if gouging never happens. Has everyone forgotten about the California electricity crisis of 2001, in which power operators deliberately cut production to raise prices? Now, Bob, I know that it seems like it would be only, good form and I would be a good host if I kick this over to you immediately. But I'm sorry, I have to say something, just a little bit to kick things off. Has everyone forgotten about the California electricity crisis of 2001, which occurred before half the people reading this tweet were even born? Has everybody forgot? How irresponsible of you to have forgotten this obscure episode from 23 years ago that goes to show. I mean, that was the best apparently he could think to do, is to come up with this fake example from 23 years ago to try to justify Harris and her action. Now, he doesn't. Now, maybe he had another tweet about this, but he doesn't actually say whether he thinks that grocery prices are going up because of gouging. He never says that. He simply says, well, it's not like gouging never happens. Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess you could debate that, but that's not what we were talking about. We were talking about this particular thing, and he never really tells us where he stands on that, except to say, 23 years ago, I think you could argue there was a case.
Yeah, and I'm sure we are going to get in the meat of the economics there, but my take, Tom, was the same as yours. I think I retweeted him at the time and said something like, if I were going to high-five Thomas Massey for some proposal he had introduced, I wouldn't have to go back 2 decades to say this is would have been relevant back then, don't you know? So
exactly. So, but with this particular example, I dug out an old book of mine. Okay, this is from 2011, and it's so.
That was your good one.
Thank you. I know you like this book. Thank you. I'm quite fond of your books, by the way. I still can't get over that Javier Milei mentioned your chaos theory.
Or chaos theory. Yeah.
So maybe someday you can introduce me to him, so. All right, let me go here. Yeah, okay, so here we go. So it just goes to show whatever you need to know, there's probably some Woods book that has something about it in there. So I wrote this. The alleged deregulation of the California energy industry was blamed for the rolling blackouts that hit that state in the latter half of the 1990s. But where was the deregulation? Wholesale prices of electricity purchased by the state's electric power distributors could fluctuate, but the state enforced price controls on retail prices and additional regulations gratuitously sabotaging the industry were introduced. Demand for electricity grew dramatically during the 1990s, driven by population growth and the voracious power demands of the state's flourishing computer industry. At the same time, no additional power facilities were allowed to be built, and the environmental lobby even managed to close down several existing plants. Thus, with demand rising, supply not allowed to expand, and providers unable to price electricity in accordance with these conditions, the result was rolling blackouts. This is surprising? Time after time, the environmental lobby intervened to prevent the alleviation of the power shortages by the production of additional facilities. And time after time, the shortages were blamed, nonsensically, on deregulation, which is more easily made into a boogeyman than the politically fashionable environmental movement. So that doesn't sound exactly like there was this free market and then evil people got together and colluded. But do you have any recollection? I mean, what were you, like 8 years old when this crisis was happening?
A little bit older. I was still bald at that time. And this is one, I know we throw this around a lot, but it really was predicted by free market friendly energy economists at the time. I mean, it's consistent with what you were saying there, but in big picture, they didn't deregulate the retail sector, right? So it wasn't that the power producer, could charge the end consumer higher prices to ration the usage. That was still regulated because we got to protect the consumer. You can't have laissez-faire when it comes to electricity. That's a basic necessity. It was they deregulated the wholesale side. And so I don't know a lot, but there were free market economists ahead of time saying, what are you thinking? What do you think is going to happen if you allow wholesale prices to rise, but not the retail ones? You're going to have shortages. What do you think is going to happen? And also, so I think Rob Bradley called it re-regulation as opposed to deregulation. He's saying this isn't a move towards free markets. And also, for what it's worth, I mean, this isn't entirely fair, perhaps, but one of the companies associated with that debacle was Enron. And Tom, I don't know, do you remember the Nobel-winning economist who was an advisor to that company?
Oh, and who would that be, Bob?
It would be Paul Krugman. And then in his defense later, he said, I'm paraphrasing here, but when people were he was basically saying, oh, come on, they just paid me a nice salary to have me on their letterhead. I didn't actually do anything for them. I was just taking a paycheck. Come on. So, which I can believe.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
So, all right. So that's Krugman. All right. But now we want to go into this whole price gouging thing for just a few minutes.
And just think, Doug, if we were still doing the old show, we would have to make this drag out another 28 minutes at least.
Don't you feel liberated? We can talk about other people now?
Yes.
Well, you did an episode of the Bob Murphy Show on the general subject. Then you released an episode of the Human Action Podcast with Jonathan Newman, where you went into some of the more, because you can talk about what Standard Economics 101 would tell you if you tried to implement a policy like this, what is likely to happen. But now we have, it's like these days, Bob, you have certain economists who, in the service of politicians they admire, just want to say, everybody else in the economics profession is an old fuddy-duddy who's just sticking to the textbook. But I'm sophisticated, and I go out into the real world and look at the data, and I'll tell you something that, supply curves actually, blah, blah, and this just keeps happening, whether it's the minimum wage or whatever it is. And now it's this matter of prices. Now, what I was reading, though, was not so much, I think, what you were talking about in your Human Action podcast recently, but evidently there is some work that's been done arguing that concentration in the grocery industry can well be an explanation for the higher prices. And you could imagine them saying, why would you blame a generic cause like the Fed's inflation of the money supply, which you would think would affect, all different markets, when we have ready at hand a very specific cause that's grocery specific, namely growing concentration there? Wouldn't that seem to be the more likely explanation?
Okay, so a bit to unpack. I'll say some things here, Tom, and then if you want to take the conversation, just let me know what you want to pursue. So one thing is, again, big picture, to say, it's the reason that grocery store prices are higher is because of greed or concentration. If it's not something that rose fairly rapidly, like in 2021, 2022, and then subsided, that's going to be difficult, right? So if it's just market concentration, yeah, it may have been trending upward, but I don't think it went way up in 2021, 2022, and then fell off a cliff again. So it would be hard to explain the specific movements. Whereas something like just looking at the M2 money stock there, that does match the government's own figures for the food at home component of the CPI. It's not hand in glove, but it matches pretty well. All right. So there's that element. Beyond that, though, look, what do we want to say as far as Misesians, when it comes to what's the role of profit and loss, that there was a shift, especially right after the lockdown era, of people were buying from grocery stores more, relative to other things. So even on its own terms, I'm not trying to explain away and say, oh no, there were no higher profits for a few years at that point. Like that's what you would have expected to see. Just like I'm sure Amazon, did better than if there hadn't been the COVID stuff. And obviously I know, Tom, you are a champion of explaining why those lockdowns were bad policy and so forth. And I agree with you. But my point is just, as of 2019, certain businesses and industries were in a position that they were going to do a lot more for their customers going forward than other ones. And it's not shocking that they might have seen a blip in their profits. And incidentally, too, just to make sure we have the absolute numbers here, the profit margins in the grocery sector, when they maxed out at 3% in, I think, 2020, and then they fell back down. And so I think as of 2023, they were back down to 1.6%. And in 2019, they hit 1%. Okay, so it's not like there's these huge fat margins that are being exploited. We're talking about a surge in profits and record profits for the grocery sector. The actual margins are still quite small.
Right, and they are not the margins you would think the average person talking about this topic would voluntarily give you if you ask them about it. What do you think they're making? They're not going to say 1% or anything like that. So,
right, I think I've seen people do it the other way. Like if you just grab people and said, what do you think a fair markup would be in the grocery sector? Let them volunteer it. They probably would say numbers higher than 3%, even though that was the jaw-dropping, record-breaking, unconscionable Robert Reich is running, for the swooning couch levels of profit that were the height of it in the whole sector. So,
yeah, I think Peter Schiff did something similar when he went out to talk to the Occupy Wall Street people. I think he might have been asking them how much they thought he ought to pay. And he's saying, well, I'm paying triple that, something like that. So,
in terms of his taxes?
Yeah, exactly. So, you let them give their number and then we'll see where it all comes out.
So I don't know, Tommy, do you want to get into the whole, like the Jamie Galbraith, Isabel Weber, like the route they took on this stuff to try to do the real world versus the theory?
Yeah, because, so you just talked about that with Jonathan Newman. Let's talk a little bit about that. And then I do want to go into, again, it'll only take a few minutes, but I thought you explained really, really well the exact consequences of these laws, which they're saying, price gouging laws. They're saying a lot of states already have them on the books. All we're doing is extending them, in this case, to the federal level. But your point was, but they're bad on the state level, and you explained it. I mean, I couldn't possibly have improved on it. So your NYU PhD served you really well in that, Bob.
Okay, so we'll real fast do okay, so like Tom was saying, folks, the standard thrust is people come out for anti-price gouging. A bunch of free market economists come forward and pundits and whatever, and they, no, price controls are bad. And then you have pushback saying, oh, this is just, textbook Econ 101 stuff. We can, they teach more than Econ 101. Am I right? And so one of the things was, it was Jamie Galbraith and Isabella Weber, and they had a piece where they were arguing and saying, no, the economists are wrong on this. And they had a lot of, or at least Weber does, has a lot of work. I think she's relatively younger, on market concentration, things like in terms of the academic literature. But for this pop topic, they were saying, look, you got guys like Jason Furman, who's no right winger, by the way, defending it and saying, oh, egg prices were high so when this Kamala Harris's thing came out, a lot of economists, even Democratic ones, were coming out and saying, nah, this isn't a good idea. And so Furman was one of them. So this was, August 2024, quoted in the New York Times saying, look, egg prices were high, rose last year because supply was down, and then that brought forth more eggs. You don't want to interfere with that if what you want is more food getting to people's tables. And so Galbraith and Weber wanted to poo-poo that, and they were saying, oh, no, the higher prices didn't bring forth more eggs. hens don't respond to prices, ha, ha, ha. And they were saying the supply was actually the highest in 2019, and then it trended down and so forth. So on that, what was funny is you went and looked at their actual data, like, they had a link. It's a data as of November 2023. Okay, so they couldn't possibly have been showing Furman was wrong because, their data source ended. Now, what happened is even in their own chart, though, of the source they cited, they showed that they thought the projections were egg production was going to be higher in 2024 than in 2023. And so the point is that was consistent with Furman's story. He wasn't saying we now have an all-time high in egg production. He was just saying the prices spiked last year, and now production went up higher. And also, just anecdotally, I talked to a bunch of, farmers and such, people like Crunchy folks on Twitter, and they're saying, especially given a year, higher prices, you can have the hens be in production longer. And so, whereas you would have taken them out earlier. So this idea that you can't get more eggs out of the hens if higher prices, that's just not true, right? So I'm saying things like that where they make it look like they're appealing to the data and whatever, but when you actually go through, kind of like Contra Krugman days time, where if you click the link and go, see, when they say, see, this proves we're right, it's like, no, actually that completely validates everything Furman said, that if you're worried about getting more food to people, allowing higher prices brings forth more food. There's nothing mysterious about that.
My friends, if it feels like we could be on the verge of psychos taking a great leap forward in their war on normal people, well, you're not alone. And if you're not therefore at least thinking about a plan B, what exactly would have to happen before you would? I'm so proud to be speaking at the Expat Money Summit, the world's largest offshore event taking place entirely online, October 7th through 11th. It's put on by Mikkel Thorup, host of the Expat Money Show, a repeat Tom Woods Show guest, and a highly sought-after expat consultant with over 2 decades of experience. Honestly, Mikkel is one of the most impressive people I know, and trust me, that's saying something. Discover why international diversification is a must for those looking to preserve their liberty and wealth. There's never been a more urgent time to develop a plan B, and here's where you can learn everything you need to know about crafting your perfect plan B, how to quickly acquire a second passport, diversify your finances offshore, invest in international real estate, and get in-depth insights on geopolitics from world-renowned experts. Headline speakers include Dr. Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Scott Horton, Ol Woods here, Mark Faber, and many others. To reserve your complimentary ticket, head over to expatmoneysummit.com. That's expatmoneysummit.com. And not to mention, on the margin, if I'm wondering what industry I should enter, and I know that one of them is shot through with challenges by the Justice Department about how I price things, on the margin, I'm going to think, well, maybe there are other things I could do for a living. So I think anything that discourages people from going into the production of food and the retail sale of food is probably bad in general.
Yeah, and so this kind of just flows into the generic critique. So you're right, Tom. A lot of the people, they were defending Kamala Harris's, everyone's freaking out, the right-wing Twitter about this, but all she's doing is federalizing this, state laws. And so, one response is to say, okay, so then on the margin, how is that really doing? In other words, it's like, what's the big deal? All she's doing is just codifying what's already on the books everywhere. So, on the one hand, it's like, okay, so then why is she our savior? But even on its own terms, right, and just because states do have those laws in the books doesn't mean that they're good. And people, it's so the implication is, hey, it's not like people in Florida right now can't have eggs. And so what's the big deal? Well, yeah, but when there are natural disasters, which is when these anti-gouging laws kick in, right? So there's clauses in them saying, seller, what does it mean to have an anti-gouging law? Typically, the legislation says things like a seller can't raise prices strategically to take advantage of some sort of natural disaster or some crisis situation. That's kind of the language. So for one thing, that's not really relevant right now. So it's not obvious how even federalizing just that language is going to do anything, in terms of the general high prices that consumers face at the grocery store right now. But beyond that, even on its own terms, there's a two-pronged thing that when there's a natural disaster, there's an earthquake or there's a flood or something, and people can't get access to bottled water, just whatever stock is on hand. Yep, left to its own devices, there would be, quote, price gouging, and a bottle of water might jump to whatever, $8 a bottle temporarily until the situation gets resolved. So why is that actually a good thing, and why would it be bad to have the attorney general have a hotline that people would know, maybe after the fact, people are going to take pictures with their phones and then these people would be prosecuted. Because number one, for the limited stockpile of water, you don't want the first few people getting to the store to clean out the shelves, which is what your natural inclination would be, right? If there's a disaster in your area and you know that it might be a while before things go back to normal and you want to help your household, if you get to the store and there's cases of water, why wouldn't you stock up on that and toilet paper and batteries and whatever? But a high price will dissuade you. You'll just take what you really need to realistically get through, the few days until normalcy returns. So there's that element. But then also the high price brings in potential supplies from neighboring regions, right? They, guys might throw cases of water in their pickup truck and drive it in, but they're not going to do that if they're just getting, quote, the normal return on that. They might do it though if, the price spikes. So there's that element. But then even more fundamentally, I think, it's not just a law of nature to say in a given region how much water, for example, is being carried in the inventories of the local Costco and the, convenience stores and whatnot, that if you're a big store like a Walmart or whatever, and you're deciding how much bottled water at any given time do we want to have in the back room or do we want to have in a warehouse that's just down the street, part of that is, that would be affected if you did calculations and said, if you're in an area that's prone to hurricanes or floods or what have you, and say, there's a 0.1% chance that we might be able to temporarily sell bottles of water at $8 a pop. What's that going to do on the margin? You're going to carry a bigger inventory, right? In a world where you were allowed to charge that. And so if what we want to do is have people get more access to water when there's an emergency, allowing for temporary, quote, price gouging actually facilitates that, right? For all those different mechanisms. Whereas in a world where the store knows, no, if we did try to do that, we would be penalized afterward. The attorney general would set up a hotline and we get, hauled into court and get fined. Then they're not going to do that. And you can say, fine. So everyone knows we don't have prices jacked up on us during an emergency. And then don't be shocked when Walmart runs out of water because they weren't carrying enough to get through the crisis. So, all these things are in play here. And as with this typical in economics, Tom, that we have to compare it to the alternate reality, right? If there's a big storm that hits and we don't run out of bottled water, nobody really thinks about it. They don't take it, they don't say, gee, what were the institutional factors that allowed for the merchants in the area to have enough water on hand? They don't go through that. They only notice it when things don't work. And then of course they blame greed and, things like that, market power, stuff that was already true for all the other times when the crisis didn't happen.
There was an article somewhere, Bob, where the headline was something like, sometimes you just need to ignore the economists.
Yeah.
And Peter Klein had a response to that saying, these very same people would never be caught dead saying, sometimes you just need to ignore the epidemiologists or the virologists or whatever. It would never, ever occur to them to say that. But I think, and I didn't have a chance to look at it, but that they might have been saying that, sometimes we have to think in terms of fairness and justice and stuff like that. Were they saying that?
They were. I did skim it at the time to see, is there anything here worth grappling with? And it was mostly platitudes. It wasn't, there was that, it wasn't worth my time to even try to write a rebuttal article or something too. So there was that element. It's tricky with this stuff because, and I've joked around on Twitter on these lines before to say things like, I'll go to some kind of, a dinner or something that's held by a friend and there's people there and people are just making small talk. And when they ask me what I do and I say I'm an economist, they have no problem, asking me, what do you think about the economy? And then sharing their views on what the Fed ought to do as if, they had just asked me what my favorite band was and they gave me their opinion as well. Whereas like if the guy to their right had been a heart surgeon, I don't think they would have, said, well, here's my views on surgery. And so on the one hand, there's that element but on the other hand, I can understand because, economists really haven't, a great track record that I would trust heart surgeons in terms of their narrow lane of expertise more than economists, as you and I, exhibited by having a podcast devoted to a Nobel laureate in economics. So
that's right. But on the subject of, well, it just doesn't seem fair that people should pay these prices. I think you've explained that without those prices, then the first few people there just get everything. But also, I think maybe there's a part of them that is attracted to the egalitarianism of everybody has to wait in line for their ration of the limited supply. So we put price controls on gas, well, there are gas lines, but there's something egalitarian about it. Everybody has to wait in line, as opposed to, well, the rich can go and fill up at the high price. But the answer to that is the Rockefellers can just get one of their servants to stand in line. You're not actually
right.
bringing about an equal outcome. They're still off, riding horses or whatever it is they do all day, other than being evil. Whatever they do all day, they're just doing that. They hire somebody to stand in line.
Yeah, there's that element. I mean, also too, like how many different lines do you have to stand in? There's things people need, especially in an emergency. The last thing you want when your house is filling up with water or something is now to have to go wait in line just to get some food or what have you, and toilet paper. That's not some optimal outcome either. And also too, I want to say, while we have a bit of time here to discuss it, you and I we're both Christian. Yeah, I know that Catholics have a big view on terms of social responsibility and whatnot. So what I would say, like if I'm a store owner in a region and there's an emergency that hits, and then I reap genuine windfall profits, by which I mean that it wasn't that I was carrying extra inventory because I knew, there's a small chance I'm going to be able to charge, quote, above normal rates. And that's what justifies me, having bigger warehouse space and having more cases of water on hand, in which case I do need to occasionally charge that high price in order for that to make sense. But no, if it was like, no, I would have been carrying this amount of inventory either way, then what you can do, and I think the right thing to do as being someone who cares about the poor, but also understands economics and market prices, is to still charge, quote, what the market will bear, so that, again, the first few people to your store don't just clean the shelves out. But then with those windfalls, you can donate that to the local Red Cross that's, handing out bottled water to people who can't afford it, or whatever the situation may be, right? Then they, especially if you look into the charity and see they do have procedures in place to really channel it to the genuinely needy, that's fine. So again, it's John Cochran had a good take on this stuff with the anti-gouging stuff when Kamala Harris made the proposal. And I'm paraphrasing, but he said something like, don't use prices to try to fix income inequality. And so he was saying, if what really the issue is, there's some people that might not have access to the limited supply because of income, will then have a program set up to give them some money and let them go into the market then and pay the, quote, price gouging prices. Don't just say, the solution is we're just going to cap the prices and have, shortages, and just assume that, the poor now are at least waiting in line with the rich and everybody else. That's not the optimal way to solve it either. I mean, what if there's a poor household with 5 kids and there's a rich guy with no kids? The right answer is not that the poor and the rich guy both still get the same, quota of, each household gets 1 case of water, but that's it. No, maybe you want the poor household to get more water than the rich household. And so you don't fix that by just having a cap on prices and then the store implements, rationing through quantity. That's not how you fix it either. But instead of you had income support, the rich guy's not going to go buy 10 cases of water if he doesn't need it. Right. So even though he could, quote, afford it if he wanted to, or right now, it's like rich people always clean stores out of bottled water, even though they could afford to, because they don't, they buy what they need. So I'm just saying that it's using the wrong instrument to try to deal with what may be a genuine problem. But again, in general with this stuff, just like if you care about kids not being able to read, well, don't institute public schools and have property taxes and blah, blah, blah. Worst case, just give money to poor parents so they can afford, to help pay for the kids' education, or the schools can, give reduced tuition or what have you.
You could say the same thing about the minimum wage. I think Walter Block has said the same thing about the minimum wage. If your problem is the poor don't have enough money, give them more money. But there's no reason that you need to do this through the employer and with all the consequences that leads to, and it doesn't necessarily follow. The employer is the only person on earth who's materially helping the person. Like, why should the burden fall on him? So anyway, there are a lot of unanswered questions and stuff like this. Well, here's an unanswered question, or not answered enough maybe for folks listening. Why is it that when the Fed pursued, let's say, accommodating policies in the wake of 2008, we didn't see the kind of consumer price inflation that we've seen during the, let's say, again, accommodating policy around the time of COVID?
Yeah, great question. I have a whole lecture at Mises University I devoted to that. I think if you Google my name and QE versus COVID or something like that, you should be able to find it. But yeah, big picture. I spent a while going through, and this was something that was near and dear to my heart, Tom, because as you know, I try to be intellectually honest. And so I was concerned that after COVID, and when guys like Krugman were saying, oh, the inflation's transitory, and that blew up in their faces, some people on, our side, if you will, Tom, were running victory laps saying, gee, the Fed dumps in boatloads of money and the government has massive deficits. What do you think's going to happen to prices? But my concern was right, but some of us were saying things like that back in 2010, and it wasn't as clear. So I do think, yes, the government played games with the CPI and whatever, and understated what the genuine consumer price inflation was back during the rounds of QE. But clearly, gas did not zoom up to $8 a gallon the way some people feared when the Fed was dumping all that money in. So I think, big picture, one way to see it, Tom, is the money in the hands of the public did not rise as rapidly back, 2009, 2010 as it did 2020, 2021. And the way you can see that is looking at something like M2. And let me just last little note for the purists out there. At the time, in 2009, 2010, the reason I didn't catch that distinction or that subtlety is I was looking at what was M1, which is also a measure of the money in the hands of the public. And that really was rising pretty rapidly, not as much as, just how much the Fed was dumping in terms of what's a bank called bank reserves, but the amount of money in checking account balances and actual currency, that was rising fairly rapidly. But part of what was happening, if you remember back in the financial crisis, Todd, is there were some big funds that they say they broke the buck, some mutual funds. And so people and the Fed at the same time, they changed the limit on FDIC. So they bumped it up. It had been $100,000, that the government was guaranteeing for checking accounts, and they raised that to $250,000. And so what happened after the crisis in 2008 is a lot of people were sucking money out of things like money market mutual funds and putting them into checking accounts because they thought that was safer. And so that was making M1 rise, but it wasn't showing like, oh yeah, there's all this extra money sloshing around. It was kind of just moving stuff from one category to another. Whereas if you just looked at M2, which was included money market mutual funds, you wouldn't have seen that. You could see, oh yeah, M2 wasn't really rising all that rapidly. It was just movements within the components of M2 that made M1 look like it was surging. So big picture, I think, in terms of the standard economics, Tom, that a lot of the money the Fed dumped in after the 2008 crisis mostly just went into the banking system, and it didn't spill out into broader public cash available for spending. Whereas famously, with the 2020 lockdowns, not only did the Fed dump in more than they did during, the rounds of QE in a shorter time frame, but also with the stimulus checks and whatnot, there was mechanisms in place to make sure that there was general widespread spending of that money.
Folks, sometimes you think you just have no choice and you have to do something you hate. But sometimes you do have a choice and you just don't know it. Take big tech. Google, Microsoft, Apple, Zoom, you name it. They think your private data is their playground for their advertising networks and AI systems. Well, one way you can avoid all those things is not using the quote-unquote free tools big tech wants you to use. Federated Computer, on the other hand, which you may not have heard of before the Tom Woods Show, offers a full replacement for Google, Microsoft Office 365, Slack, Zoom, all the tools of big tech, but designed for people who care about privacy, don't want to be treated like cattle, and want a great price. Everything's encrypted end-to-end and fully backed up daily. We're talking about private email, file storage, group chat, WordPress, all the applications you need for your business or team, all bundled into one easy monthly subscription that's 10 times less expensive than big tech offerings. You get unlimited users, fantastic personal customer support from real human beings, and the assurance that your data is your data and not big tech's. Visit www.federated.computer for your free 30-day trial and use coupon code WOODS for 10% off your first 6 months. So how about that? A company that thinks its job is to provide you with services for a great price rather than spying on you or shutting you up or manipulating you. So take your first step with other happy Woods listeners towards digital freedom. Visit www.federated.computer today for your free 30-day trial and use coupon code WOODS for 10% off your first 6 months. Do you think now that this changes things in that in the old days, let's say we were talking about this topic in the late 1960s, you wouldn't have had to wait to see the particulars of the case. You would say, well, if the Fed is being expansionary, then we can expect a rise in consumer prices. Now, do you feel like we've been chastened a bit and we need to insert a caveat and say, well, this could lead to higher consumer prices, but there are particulars we have to keep an eye on to see if that'll happen or not?
Well, certainly, okay, so put it this way. What the Fed did because of the 2008 crisis was unprecedented, right? They didn't even expand things that rapidly in the world wars, I don't believe, certainly not in that tight of a time frame. And so I think, so the issue, in terms of could the Fed inject a bunch of money that kind of stays bottled up inside the financial sector and doesn't spill out into the broader hands of the public? I mean, that distinction theoretically was always there in earlier decades, but I don't think you ever just saw the huge discrepancy in practice between those two. So I don't know if that's answering your question. So I mean, in other words, Tom, I think theoretically that distinction was still there in earlier times. It's just the Fed never dumped so much money in so rapidly. And the other element too is that partly why the banks didn't just lend that all out was a combination. The Fed started paying interest on reserves, right? So that was a good line I had when I was giving presentations to crowds in the financial sector after 2008 for a while there, where I was saying, oh yeah, they were wringing their hands and saying, we don't want to bail out these big banks that made all these bad mortgage loans and whatever, but you know what? We have to bail out Wall Street in order to save Main Street, right? That was kind of the line they gave. And while they did that, the Fed started paying banks to not make loans to their customers, right? That's what interest on reserves is they're telling banks, keep your funds parked at the Fed, we'll pay you. They implemented that policy in October of 2008, right? They had gotten statutory authority to implement it earlier, but they weren't supposed to, and they pulled it forward when they started doing that, right? So there's that element. And then just, the bank's balance sheets were shot because of the, housing bubble and crash. So there were various factors at play as to why, even when the Fed was dumping in boatloads of new reserves, the banking system wasn't eager to turn around and lend, as a pyramid on top of that. Whereas in earlier decades, that generally was the case. So normally the Fed pumps in base money and then the banking system goes out and makes loans on top of that so that excess reserves stay close to zero. Excess reserves went through the roof following the rounds of QE. And so that, so that partly explains. So theoretically, could that have happened in the 60s? I think so. But just for various reasons, that wasn't typically the case. So you didn't see that divergence between what the Fed was pumping in versus broader spending.
I think the other policy that's generated the most discussion has been the taxing of unrealized capital gains. So I'd like to say a little something about that. And I think we can dispense pretty quickly with the claim that this applies only to people earning $100 million or some kind of thing, or with $100 million in wealth. I forget what the $100 million applies to.
Can we just on that though? Can we just say something that I have been astonished, and maybe I'm naive, maybe at this point, Tom, you know these people better than I do. I couldn't believe how much currency was being gained among various progressive types who were, they were mocking like average Joe right-winger MAGA people who were worried about taxing unrealized capital gains when they clearly were nowhere near the threshold. And the idea being like, why would you care about a policy that isn't going to affect you personally? And this was coming from progressive leftists. And so for one of them, I just wrote and said, do you understand why adults might oppose child abuse? I mean, their point was that stupid.
Yeah.
And, so.
I'm so glad you said that, because I was intending and then forgot to write in my email about this subject, in my newsletter. I was going to say, I think of these people as fellow human beings, and I don't think of them as cash cows to be milked. And so I don't sit here thinking, oh, well, it only applies to you, so that sucks for you. It doesn't apply to me, so why should I care about it? Well, because I think that is an extremely selfish and destructive way to think about other people. Like they're just resources that we can just wring out. And there's only a handful of you. Right. So,
I had another one too that I said, so what you're saying is obviously perfectly correct, but I'm just like, for me, it was more, it's not just that they were wrong, but that they were wrong on this type of thing when that's their whole bread. Like, so I said that they came to tax the unrealized gains of people with $100 million, but my net worth was not $100 million. So I said nothing. Right? Like, isn't that their whole deal? that, you're a bad right-wing Nazi if you don't speak up when someone else is being oppressed, even because it doesn't apply to you personally. Like, that's their whole thing. And yet here, you're not worth that much. Why do you care? Anyway.
Yeah, no, I completely hear you. So it only matters. It has to be a politically fashionable group for you to speak up for. Otherwise,
right,
the state could just do its worst. So,
sorry, let me say one more. I wanted to say, well, I mean, are men allowed to, care about women's, right to an abortion? But I forgot. They would say, men can have abortions. And I'd be like, yeah, okay, yeah. You guys are being consistent on that one. Yeah.
Well, so that aspect, let's suppose that it's perfectly legitimate to pick out a group and have a policy that applies to them only, that enriches the regime. What is the particular problem? Because sometimes I've heard libertarians say, look, all taxes are bad.
Right.
But is there a particular problem that could have particular ripple effects on other people posed by this kind of tax?
Yeah, I think so. So yes, right. It's taxation is theft. That I agree with all that. That's true. You shouldn't tax realized capital gains. You shouldn't tax wage income. You shouldn't tax dividends. You shouldn't tax unrealized. But is there something extra bad about proposing to tax unrealized capital gains? And I think so. And the issue comes down to, so let me just clarify, be nuanced. It's not, I would argue, because unrealized capital gains aren't really income, right? So some people were flipping out and saying, I don't even have that, it's not income. I think they are, in terms of like accounting and just standard economic theory. You'd have to argue that they are income in a sense. And, I can send a link, Tom, if people want to follow, pursue that. But in terms of, okay, suppose they are income, but should they be taxed? Is there a reason? I mean, there's a reason right now they haven't been taxed, right? And it has to do with, first of all, just the administrative burden that, you're holding a stock portfolio. If you have to just reckon with the IRS every year in terms of that, it's going to just be a lot more complicated. That, if your portfolio went up, then you got to pay taxes on that. But then by symmetry, if your portfolio goes down, then you got to carry the losses, and that should offset. And there's a lot more there. It's easier just in terms of the administration, just to say, no, when you sell at that point, we see, what kind of a gain did you make on it? And then you pay the capital gains tax on the realized gain, if necessary. Beyond that, though, there's all sorts of things like, you have you're a founder, you have a new business, and it takes off, and you go public, whatever, you got the stock, and then the shares of stock rise, perhaps in anticipation because you make some breakthrough, you have some new announcement or whatever, and the shares of your company rise, but you haven't sold a bunch of new product, you haven't generated a bunch of income in the sense of what's hitting your company checking account. So if you were to be hit with a big tax at that point, you wouldn't be able to pay it. You just wouldn't have the funds on hand. So there's that element. So I guess that could be summarized as saying there's liquidity issues. And so there could be all kinds of scenarios you can imagine where you could have, in an accounting sense, have experienced a gain where the market value of your assets, surged, and the IRS now is going to say that's an unrealized gain. You have to pay a tax on that. And the only way you could come up with the money to pay the tax would be to break up the combination of assets that's generating that paper gain, and then kind of, killing the goose that hasn't yet laid the golden egg, right? So if you want to continue that metaphor, it's like you did find a goose, you've convinced the investors this thing's going to start cranking out golden eggs, but then if the IRS says, no, we want 10% of that goose right now, then, okay, I guess we're going to cut off a tenth of it, and then what if you killed it? Right. So it's that kind of thing. I don't know if we want to keep going into Aesop's fables or if we should stop there.
Well, but what if, when in fact I do go to, quote, realize the gain, events have intervened such that it's no longer a gain. I'm realizing a loss, but I've already paid on the unrealized gain. But it turned out when I realized it, it wasn't a gain. Do I get to claw any of that back, or do they just keep that?
So I think, with this stuff, it's kind of like, well, no, they said they're only going to tax above 100 million, right? So we can analyze in terms of what's the theory and then what's the practice. So in principle, yes, that's a valid fear to bring up and to say, hey, I'm not sure I trust these guys if they're going to be fair. So in principle, they should allow you to carry, to recognize the loss, and at the very least, that should offset your future tax payments as like you work down that negative balance, if you will. And in principle, they should even give you a big refund. So, but again, that's partly why administratively, I think historically, they don't do this, is just because, it would be such a huge burden to keep track of everything. Another element that I've looked, so Tyler Cowen actually had a good post just going through, like he went and looked at the actual proposal and to the extent that one exists. I think it was more like people were saying, oh, what Kamala Harris is going to base it on is, this policy brief from over here. It's not like her website has all this spelled out, but in terms of trying to get your hands around what would this look like in practice if they went to do it, there's proposals floating around from, left of center organizations, as they say. And it gets into all kinds of distinctions between liquid assets versus illiquid. And, you're not going to have to pay it, on an illiquid asset because we recognize then you got to, sell the family farm in order to come up with the money to pay the tax. And we don't want to have to do that. We don't want to have the companies to get broken up just because they got to make a tax payment. But then that leads to all sorts of gamesmanship as well, right? That it's pretty easy on paper, especially for big companies with armies of tax accountants, to just change the structuring of their organization to take account of all these different types of loopholes. So your concern is quite valid, Tom. I think a defender of the policy would come back to you and say, no, it's not that stupid. That if you had a gain on paper, you pay a tax that year, but then if the stock tanks, then you have either a refund or at least like a negative balance that gets whittled down with your other liabilities. But in practice, how would that work? And certainly, at the very least, we don't want people to be in a position of having to make a loan to the IRS because of valuation. Because that's the other element too, is especially if it's not like if it's stock in a publicly traded corporation, okay, you kind of have an objective market price. But for lots of assets, there's not daily trading or even periodic trading, like even stuff like your property valuation for your local property tax. A lot of people have issues with that and think that maybe, the local tax is higher than it ought to be, that they're inflating the value. I couldn't sell my house for this amount if I wanted to, that kind of stuff. So when it comes to assets that don't just have a daily ascertainable market price, that opens up another whole can of worms where how are they going to determine? And then whatever mechanism they use, there's going to be lots of gamesmanship involved, and probably the IRS is going to lean towards on the scales and make it so that you owe more tax than you really ought to pay, even according to their own system.
So what is the effect, let's say, of somebody who qualifies to unfortunately be subject to this tax saying, along with other such people, well, if this is going to happen to me, then I'm obviously not going to put my money into things that would be considered to be capital gains. So I'll just hold it in cash. I'll figure out something. I'll put it in something, but I won't put it in these kinds of, we might say productive outlets.
Mm-hmm.
How does that affect everybody else in society?
Yeah, and I think this is where some of the, let's say, free market type economists were really focusing their fire, I think correctly so, is that not all entrepreneurship is created equal. And in terms of what companies are going to be giving us the goods and services 10 years from now that are really going to transform our lives, it's not going to be the existing ones right now that are just going to tweak things on the margin. The truly innovative ones, people, forming new companies that it's a long shot. And the reason no one else has done this yet is because it's not clear how to do it. But then, you might hit a home run. You might be the next Amazon. You might be the next Google or whatever. That's the sort of thing where you need a gestation period, like you say, Tom, where going from the proverbial guy in his garage forming a company with his buddies to then having 10,000 employees and everything's pretty smooth and straightforward. In between those 2 points, there's a lot involved, and you do need the freedom and the flexibility to be able to just have the thing grow without being taxed, to allow the gains to be unrealized so that the founder goes from having a normal job and then maybe quitting once the business takes off, not paying himself a very high salary because he's just sitting on shares of stock. And then if his company all of a sudden down the road's worth 20 billion, now he's one of the richest guys walking around because he owes half the company and now it's 20 billion. But to get there, that probably would not have happened, as you say, Tom, had he been having to make periodic tax payments along the way commensurate with the paper value of his company, which is just, a bunch of investors in their mind imagining what this might be in the future, right? So it's a very interesting, thing to think in terms of conceptually what it means for the valuation of a company or a group of assets if it's not generating that flow of revenue right now. And that's the kind of thing that they're trying to tap into. And so again, back to your question, if you're going to cripple that, then that's really the source of innovation, for things that are revolutionary. And so it's the kind of thing where we won't know what we're missing, right? So if they go ahead and implement it, that's an issue too. They could go ahead and implement it, and it probably would cause, the market to come down, whether it would be a crash or it would just be the trigger if you think the market's overvalued. That wouldn't surprise me. But I could imagine them doing it, and then it's not like everyone just starves to death. If they starve, it'll be because of the price gouging stuff, not because of this. And people say, yeah, see, everyone warned of all these catastrophes, but we don't know what would have been invented in the absence of this. That's kind of the point.
I think that's as far as we need to go. I wanted to hit those two things primarily, the price gouging and the unrealized capital gains thing. She keeps, it really is true that I don't know why she's changed her mind on some things, but sometimes she's changed her mind to become more, reasonable. But on this, she didn't have a position on price gouging before, so that just came out of the clear blue. And unrealized capital gain, I don't think anybody ever asked her opinion on it before. So these aren't a matter of, she's moderated herself to appeal to the electorate. These are
I have a theory. I think on the grocery store stuff, I think it was because for years, the official Biden stance, not that it was coming from him, but, the people around him and then guys like Krugman or whoever who were defending him was to say inflation's, it's not happening. It's transitory. Okay, it is happening, but it's a good thing because notice how it's taking money away from rich people and giving it to debtors. And that's actually a good thing. Right. So it went through all the stages of denial and then flipping it around. And I think she realized to her campaign realized she can't run on, aren't you glad of the inflation that was, the transitory inflation that the Biden administration ushered in to get us through those supply chain bottlenecks. I think she realized, no, instead of that, we're going to go with, these economists like over here, like this Isabella Weber, who's been saying for a while, it's market power, it's gouging, right? So I think they just realized they could no longer be inflation deniers. And instead they had to pivot and somehow come up with what's in our toolkit to be able to complain about inflation, but not blame the Fed and not blame Biden's policies. And, it's gouging. That's what it's market power. And then with the taxing the 100 millionaires, they know the deficit's humongous and spending's out of control, and any kind of reasonable metric is going to show they need to bring in more revenue or something. So what are we going to do? We're not going to raise taxes on everybody. So, it's just the ultra rich. And if we do unrealized gains, that just opens up this huge reservoir of money that it can even be a fairly small percentage applied to that enormous base. And that brings in a bunch of new money without apparently hurting anybody who's, in their base in terms of voting.
Right. And yet the funny thing is, a lot of those people are in their base, but there just aren't enough of them. Each person gets one vote.
Right.
So, even if they have 100 gazillionaires, they're only losing 100 votes. They might be losing some money.
Right. Well, I don't know if you've noticed this, Tom, but it's the New York Times seems like it is at least tepidly anti-Kamala at this point. And so I've had people on the left, when I've been pointing this out, when I keep seeing all these New York Times and other print media stories that are, to me, surprisingly either neutral or even outright, Kamala's wrong on this. This is, and some people have said, no, that's just because they're good journalists. I don't think that's the explanation. But I wonder, could it be that some of these, billionaire donors to the Democratic Party are kind of letting her know, yeah, we want you to win, but what are you talking about? No, you're not taxing our unrealized gains. Are you out of your mind? I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was something like that. Because also, they did not want her to be the candidate, right? They were trying to leapfrog over her. And I think she and Van Jones and people like that said, oh, no. If you try to just skip over her, we're going to make a big stink, and you're going to have to explain why you skipped over the woman of color. And I think they just backed down. So I think there was a lot going on behind the scenes here that's not just, they hate Trump. Like, I think there's more nuance involved.
Yeah.
She's not the sharpest tool in the drawer, too. Like, I think they know that.
Yes. Right. All right, Bob, how do people follow you? You got Twitter, and I'll link to that on the show notes page, tomwoods.com/2540. What else you got?
So I'm the chief economist at Infineo. So check out our stuff there at Infineo.ai. And then the Bob Murphy Show. BobMurphyShow.com is my personal podcast.
BobMurphyShow.com. How could I forget? All right, Bob, great talking to you. Not a lot of Krugman, but that's probably just as well. People who are unhappy about that. I'm trying to find your Contra Krugman book on my show. I know it's here because I read the audiobook, but then that was such a task that I must have just tossed it away. But anyway, all right. Thanks again, Bob.
That door open in your house or something. Okay, thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.